All right, what's up, everybody? Another Q&A. I've completely lost count of what number this one is. Probably like 10 or 15 or something. I have no idea besides the point. Basically, before I get into these super interesting questions this time, actually, the way that these work, if you're new to the channel, every time I post a Q&A, you have an opportunity to get your question answered in the next video. So the way this works, if you have a question you want to see answered in the next Q&A, leave it in the comments of this video. If it's a question that I like personally, or it's a question that gets a lot of upvotes, which means other people like it, I'll pick a combination of those questions and answer them in the next one. Obviously, I can't get to every single one of them because I don't have 5 hours to film a Q&A, but I try and pick the most interesting questions and the questions that will help the most people. So with that being said, the first question for today's episode is from Rod Made It. For the next Q&A, if you take two people, one with really bad chest flexibility and one with really good chest flexibility, would the one with bad flexibility gain more muscle on an exercise like the barbell flat bench because the already limited range of motion compared to the other lifter? If so, could another form of good genetics for muscle growth be that you have generally pretty tight muscles? So with this, it's tough to say. I would say this might have an impact on stretch-mediated hypertrophy specifically, which is a different mechanism than regular hypertrophy. So it's tough to say on that, especially since we don't know everything about it. I would say that your limb length has more of an impact on what benefits you get out of your range of motion more than your flexibility probably does. It might give you more of a sensation of more of a stretch if you have tight muscles on like the flat barbell bench, for example. But I think if you're somebody that can get a deep range of motion on a barbell bench, that will probably give you more gains than somebody that has little tiny short arms that has a huge barrel chest and doesn't get much range of motion. So I would say just based on instinct alone, I would probably say this gives more of a sensation in the actual lift. Probably not extra growth, although it might have some correlation with stretch-mediated hypertrophy, but who knows? I can't give a 100% definite answer on that one. Next question from Lightning Arrow 4486. For the next Q&A, how do you properly count reps, especially for pulling exercises? I find that when doing rows and such, I quickly start to lose a bit of ROM, and this gradually decreases as the set progresses. It kind of blurs the lines between ordinary partials and full reps, and it makes it hard to know how to track the sets. This kind of relates to a question posted by someone else regarding how to count partials. So this is a really good question, and it's part of the reason why tracking short and biased movements can be such a nightmare. So with these, while there's peak resistance in the contracted position, I would also recognize that that is the least stimulative portion of the range of motion, most likely. So what I would either do is try to count reps the best that you can. And of course, that's very basic advice. But I would say if you're certain or even mostly certain that a rep was a full range of motion, I would count that. Partials you can count separately, but you can also count cheat reps if those are a viable option too, which in rows I generally do like to steer towards, especially as lifter becomes more advanced. I think with the resistance profile being so skewed, using something like a cheat plate-loaded row or a cheat single-arm dumbbell row, things like these can just even out the resistance profile a bit so you can get through that sticking point that's not that stimulative anyways. And at the same time, you can get a little bit more weight and more of a challenge on the eccentric of that lift. So cheat reps would be what I'd recommend. Partials are fine too, but keep in mind you're only getting a partial range of motion instead of a full eccentric. So that's something to keep in mind. I generally do opt for cheat reps over partials if I had to pick. I would probably track this as pick your method first. So are you going to do a straight set with strict technique and then partials, or a straight set with strict technique and then cheat reps? The way I do this is count how many reps that you're certain or more certain are full strict reps with the full range of motion, and then I would put a plus sign plus however many partials you decide to do, which are definitely tougher to track than cheat reps because the range of motion is all out of whack. Or if you do cheat reps, I would just do plus however many cheat reps you do with a specific amount of cheat that you try not to deviate from too much. That's personally how I do it for rows. Good question, tough to fully answer because it is just a pain to track. At the same time, even this might be advice that kind of goes against the grain, but not even tracking your rows in some cases might even help you out a little bit too, because sometimes it's easy to get bogged down mentally of, oh, I didn't add a rep to my lat pull down or my row, but it's so hard to read that anyways, where it might just be better to just plan on adding 5 pounds every month or two or something like that, and just know that you can probably handle it and you'll be fine. And if your technique starts to suck, then you can drop weight back again. Next question from Timothy Lifts. For the next Q&A, if someone's already able to get pretty good depth, well beyond 90 degrees in knee flexion on a leg press, how much value do you think using implements like yoga blocks and whatnot to really get that extremely deep position has? Applies to other stuff like hack squats as well. So I would say if the lift is lengthen biased and this helps you get into that lengthened position, I'm all for it. For a lift like a leg press, it's potentially helpful to get you a bit more of a stretch, but at the same time, a leg press is generally going to be mid-range biased anyways, so it's not the end of the world to not get that crazy deep stretch on a leg press. I would say for something like a hack squat where it is a little bit more length and bias, especially with a lower stance, this could definitely help. So I would say if it lets you stay in a comfortable and stable setup, then go for it. More range of motion can always help you get more stimulus and be able to get more at a less weight, so at least less fatigue. Yeah, it's kind of as simple as that. So that's a boring answer, but it might be the most practical one. And then with Black Friday coming up, Barbell Apparel has their athletic fit jeans. Any jeans, chinos, or pants available on sale for $99, or you can get the upgraded Athletic Fit 2.0 jeans for $119. If you've been doing your hack squats, you guys know the struggles. I guarantee you, we all have that pair of jeans that's been collecting dust in our closet because it doesn't even fit over our quads. So with these jeans, not only does it solve that problem, you can also hack squat in them if you like. You can check my collection through Barbell Apparel in the description. Next question from BSO. For the next Q&A, recently switched to full body. What do you think the minimum amount of sets per muscle group is to stimulate growth per session? I'll get enough weekly volume through the high frequency, but just want to make sure I'm actually stimulating the muscles with enough sets each session. So thanks and loving the Q&A. So thanks, man. I appreciate that. But this is a good question. I would say you're already on the right track about looking at per session volume versus weekly volume. I do think weekly volume has a time and place, but I don't think you should reverse engineer your program based on trying to meet an somewhat arbitrary weekly volume range. When it comes to per session volume, so one set, especially if you're training 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week for that muscle group, can definitely be enough to stimulate growth. It's not what I'd recommend. So for full body, I'm going to assume you're training 3 times a week. I'd recommend starting off at 2 sets per session with a highly potent lift. Anything that might be a little bit less potent, like something that's short and biased, or maybe something that's even just a little bit more strict, something like that you might have to go a little bit higher on. So it does depend on, 1, the muscle group, but it also, 2, even more importantly, depends on what lift you're using. So if you're taking something like a hack squat, for example, and you're doing an all-out set on hack squats with a low stance, pushing hard, you're already a good lifter and proficient in that lift, and it's a length and bias lift, getting a crazy stretch in your quads, you could probably grow pretty well off of doing 1 set of hack squats all out 3 times a week. I would opt for 2 sets though. The only time I'd really opt for 1 set in an optimal scenario is if you already have another lift before that. So the 1 set is just in addition to the sets you've already done for that muscle with a different lift. So I would say start at 2 for everything. Unless you're training 4, 5, 6 times a week per muscle group, I would say start at 2 and see how that goes. That's typically what I like to start at and stick at for a long time for most lifts. Weekly volume wise, it might end up putting you a little bit lower than what like the recommended weekly volume is that we've talked about for so long at this point. But at the same time, if you're getting excellent stimulus from 2 sets and any more sets are just going to end up being either redundant or you're just too fatigued and don't need or can't handle more work yet, there's no point in doing more. So I'd say sticking with 2 sets per lift or even 2 sets per muscle to start off. If you're on full body, that should be fine. From there, I would probably bump your lifts up to 3 sets, and then if that ever does plateau way down the road, I'd probably reduce back to 2 sets, add another lift at 1 set, maybe build that up to 2, and after that, you should be fine, because at that point, you're getting into like 12 plus sets per week per muscle. So, really good question, BSO. You're an OG fan. Always appreciate your good questions here. Next question from Grizzly Strength 45. For the next Q&A, of course, I know this is a purely bodybuilding channel and you have experience in powerlifting and would not go back to that. But I was wondering, as you evolve, would you ever be interested in strongman training? I feel like that kind of training lends itself to hypertrophy, as the bulk of the workload is high rep, heavy compounds and heavy isolation work and high load and high levels of conditioning. It's how I train and I freaking love it. I love the channel, brother. Keep up the great work. So first off, I appreciate that, man. That's a super interesting question. So for myself, the reason why I like quote unquote enjoy training is because it gives me the result of muscle growth. I don't actually enjoy lifting as a sport. Like if I didn't get bigger and say I could only get stronger or more conditioned, I would absolutely hate it. Like I would just stick to like a team sport or something like that. So I don't see myself ever training for strongman, even if there would be like a hypertrophy side effect, because I would just train more for hypertrophy. If I ever do become interested in strongman, it would be for a performance related goal, which I don't see myself having. I'm usually not too interested in stuff like that. I would probably, like when it comes to performance oriented goals, I like team sports. Like I just go for hockey or something like that. Good question though, and I do really respect and like strongman, but it's like as a viewer, as a fan, it's not something that I see and I'm like, oh, I want to give that a try and compete. But I can respect it for sure. Next question from George. Few letters after that, not going to try and pronounce that, so we'll just call you George. So George asks, for the next Q&A, firstly, recently found this channel and I've been binge watching. I can't speak again today. I've been binge watching all the videos. Great stuff, man. I'm really enjoying your content. You're articulate, no nonsense, and to the point. I appreciate that, man. Thank you. My question is, with respect to the rep goal system, could you explain the benefit of said system, let's say reaching 36 reps and increasing weight, over, say, a more traditional approach of reaching the top end of reps over 3 sets, for example, 12, 12, 12, and then increasing weight? Also, would you ever be interested in releasing a program template for intermediates? Thank you so much. So I probably will release an intermediate template. I know it's kind of an ongoing meme. I think in one of my first 2 or 3 videos, I said I would release an intermediate template. The more questions I got and the more experience I got working with other people, the more I kind of held back on that, just because it just varies so much person to person. So it's not something that I would be like super excited to release, because I know it would only be ideal for like whatever percentage of people. So it's a little bit, I was a little bit de-incentivized from that. But I probably will do it at some point, because a program's better than not having one, right? So your question on the rep goal system, very simple answer here. Basically, the reason for this is so you can have your reps fall off set over set. When you aim for a flat progression system, so let's say a double progression where it's not dynamic and you're just aiming to get each set to 12, by nature, you're leaving your first set and probably your second set with reps in reserve just for the sake of getting 12 reps on your third set. The amount of reps you get, as long as you're within a reasonable range, doesn't actually matter. The only thing that does matter for hypertrophy is your stimulus, and it's your proximity to failure which determines that. So how many hard reps did you get in that set? Why stop shy? Just so you can save energy to potentially get more reps on your final set. So something like a rep goal system would allow you to do, say, 14, 12, 10, where each set was to 0 reps in reserve. And yeah, you got the same total amount of reps, but your third set was less because you were fatigued from actually training very hard in your first and second set. So it just makes more sense to go that way, in my opinion. I never program regular progression, regular double progression. It's always going to be some form of dynamic progression. Next question from Hex CFH 835. I feel like every time I make a Q&A, it goes back to handles instead of like the display name. So I never know how to pronounce any of these. It's kind of annoying. For the next Q&A, How to make an upper day less crowded. I always seem to do more exercises on an upper day and feel tired 3/4 the way through the session. I don't want to move any upper body on lower days since leg work really tires me out. So you kind of just eliminated the best option. I would say moving some of your back work to your lower day makes a lot of sense. For you, the number one thing would be reducing the workload in your low priority muscles, or even putting it on maintenance. If everything's an equal priority, the one thing I do is I'd probably ditch the shoulder work, or try and get away with slightly less volume if you haven't tried that already. The reason for eliminating the shoulder work is because if any muscle is going to grow from a byproduct of training other muscles and getting other muscles bigger, it is the shoulders. So if shoulders aren't a particularly high priority and you're already doing relatively low volume, I would try that. And another thing, you could just switch up your split too. There's no need to do an upper lower split. You could try something else. A push pull legs might actually be more beneficial for you, or even a push pull legs upper lower hybrid. So you're in the gym one extra day a week, but it saves you some time in a couple sessions. Next question from BLD663. Could you briefly explain the benefits of swapping biceps and triceps on push and pull days? Is it so you can hit them harder without them being fatigued? Yeah, exactly. So when you're doing any type of press, your triceps are worked to a degree, not enough to stimulate, but you can still accumulate fatigue that way. So that's essentially why my arms were so small when I was doing my power building phase, because I would train my push movement so extremely hard and do a stupid amount of volume. And then I would always train my triceps after that. So my triceps did a lot of partial work that wasn't quite to failure. So it was enough to fatigue, but not enough to actually get them to grow. And if you can program properly around this, but it's probably not worth the risk in most cases. Of course, it can be individual. Like if you're somebody that does, say, say you're prone to elbow injuries, and it's not a good idea for you to do like a pull day and then train biceps either before or after on separate days, or vice versa with push movements and tricep isolation. That's probably not a bad idea, but essentially, if you're able, injury-wise, to swap biceps and triceps on your push and pull days, this is a good kind of a surefire way to make sure you don't end up like me, benching 330, having under 16-inch arms. I don't recommend that. Next question from JMWFit3112. For next Q&A, I understand pushing each set close to or beyond failure. If you're training beyond failure, say with partials, are you doing that for every set or just the last set? And do you count those partials for purposes of tracking progress? Congrats on the success of your channel. So when it comes to partials, I don't track those. I'll put an indicator in my spreadsheet. So if I did 8 full reps and then a handful of partials, I'll just log it as 8+. When it comes to training beyond failure, I would say find how much stimulus you need to grow first before implementing something like this. So for example, for myself, 0 RIR, pretty much across the board, I'd say 90% of my lifts, 0 RIR is exactly what I need to grow. So then that guarantees that my first, second, and potentially final set only needs that. What I would do from there is, if I wanted or felt like I needed to do a little bit more, I would reserve the intensity technique for the final set. For something that is a lift that 0 RIR might not be enough for, like a lateral raise or something, I would see what you can get growing from, whether it is 0 RIR or if you have to do partials past failure. So if it is a lift that you do have to do partials past failure for, like a lateral raise, I would just do it for every set. There's no point in saving energy in reducing stimulus just so you can have a more stimulative second set. There's no point in just leaving gains on the table just for the sake of saving energy for your future sets, because if you didn't save that energy, you might have to do less future sets. Next question from Timothy Lifts. For the next Q&A, do you think getting really hyped up for your sets, be it through music or what have you, can end up becoming counterproductive in the long run, in the sense that it will probably result in a lot of central fatigue that spills over to other sessions in the week and makes the effort level harder to replicate and beat session to session? So this is a really interesting question. I would say that getting super hyped up for your lifts is kind of individual. There's some people that definitely need it. There are a lot of people that are way too passive in the gym, and you need to kind of be able to tap into that hardcore mindset. And I think that is something that can teach you just so much, just to make you more assertive in the gym, more aggressive even. You don't want to be too passive. So I know that's not a direct answer to the question, but that's just something that I do want to get out of the way. When it comes to getting extra hyped up, I would say if it makes a big difference in your performance, then yeah, I would do it. If you're somebody that gets hyped up and you basically perform the exact same way, that's probably an indicator that you're already training hard enough anyways. Like I know for myself, when I get super hyped up for a session, I'll find little areas where I'm like, you know what, that lift I was leaving more energy in the tank than I thought I was. A lot of lifts aren't that way, but for example, my Smith bench, I got super hyped up for that set, just was like clicking with the song or like wearing a cool flannel or something, and it was just working really well. Performance didn't budge, but then I did my Smith overhead press and I gained like 4 reps on it. So I mean, it can expose weaknesses, and then you know what your next standard is, and you might not need the actual hype to get that since you know you can do it anyways. So I don't think getting super hyped up makes a huge difference. I think in a lot of cases when you're getting super hyped up, you're more prone to kind of toss the weight around, like not necessarily control the eccentric, maybe cut a little bit of range of motion. And is this kind of nitpicky? Like maybe in some cases, yeah. But I think it goes to show that you don't need to get hyped up for each set. It doesn't just magically give you a performance boost. If it does give you a performance boost, it's probably just showing you that you weren't training hard enough without getting hyped up, which, like I said, I just made the case that you can train equally as hard with the same technique, whether you're hyped up or not. So I'd focus on that. Next question from Matt GC1. Question, I always get a huge brachioradialis pump from any bicep movement, preacher curls, incline dumbbell curls, etc. Doing hammer curls and reverse grip curls light up my brachioradialis like nothing else, and I get forearm cramps the rest of the day and soreness the next day, so I've been avoiding those lately. Any tips to try and take some of the stress off the brachioradialis and more onto the biceps, other than supinating more, which I already do? Biceps currently around 16 inches and would like to get them up to 17, but seems like I'm just growing brachioradialis more. Also working out from home gyms, so don't have access to machines. So the first thing I would do here is switch to probably mostly preacher curls. Preacher curls will put your bicep in a lengthened position at the bottom of the movement, of course, and this is arguably the most leveraged position that the biceps have anyways. So compared to your other elbow flexors, this might be the best way to target your biceps. So I would give that a try. And even if you don't have a preacher curl station, you can just use an incline bench and a dumbbell, and that should work perfectly fine. So short answer, but that should help you out quite a bit. Next question from Alexandros. Thoughts on pre-exhausting with lateral raises before overhead press or AD press? I like OHP, but my front delts are understandably way ahead of my side delts. So yeah, first off, that's definitely a common thing. So nothing too unique there, but it is something that you can definitely improve. I don't think that's like a genetic thing. When it comes to deciding whether to do side raises or your overhead press variations first, basically the way I see it is if your side delts aren't contributing that much to your overhead presses, I would probably just reduce either your frequency or volume of overhead pressing and either maintain your current volume and setup of your side raises or even increase that a little bit. What this will do is slightly save you some fatigue so you can perform a little bit better, aka you can recruit more muscle fibers on your lateral raises. But even if you're going into lateral raises a little bit fatigued, you can still put out a really good output, because if your side delts weren't trained hard through overhead press variations, they'll be pretty fresh for the side raises. So the way I see it is if you're doing both, the lateral raises, even if you're not getting anything out of them, they're still an insurance policy. In worst case, if you're not getting any stimulus from the overhead press variations, you're getting stimulus in a pretty fresh state on your lateral raises. So it kind of covers every box there. I would probably stick with doing the overhead presses first, but either way, If your side delts aren't worked that heavily on overhead pressing and you haven't seen much growth, even if you train lateral raises beforehand, you'll still be able to perform arguably fine. I don't think it would increase the growth that you would get or the stimulus that you would get from your overhead presses by pre-fatiguing, just because either way they'd have a little bit less of a force output. So even if they are more of a limiting factor, there is going to be diminishing returns as your sets go on through your lift anyways. So it's probably not going to make a huge difference, but it could be worth trying for sure. Next question from, not even going to try and read that name, Cricky 6011. I don't know why they switched to handles and everything. Like I said, throwing me off a little bit. My reps often only drop off by 1 rep each set and sometimes even no reps. I do a bicep, then 3 minutes rest. For example, 765 or 766. Does that mean I don't actually go to failure? Or could it be because my work capacity is good, or do I take too much rest? So first off, there's really no such thing as too much rest unless you need to warm up again or you're just wasting a ton of time. Resting even up to 5, 6, 7 minutes, even 8 or 9 minutes on some lifts is totally fine and arguably more optimal anyways. Losing 1 rep is pretty standard. I would say for most lifts that are under 10 reps, I lose about 1 rep per set, sometimes 0. Like sometimes I can match my previous set's performance. Over 10 reps, sometimes it's 2, but I think rather than looking at it in units, I would look at that as percentage. So if I lose 2 reps on a set of 15, that's equivalent to losing 1 rep on a set of 7 or 8. So that's not an issue at all. I would just test if you're training to failure by getting to what you think is 0 RAR and then trying another rep. Obviously be safe with it and have safety parameters set up. But yeah, I would just test out your proximity to failure, and that will give you a feel of what 0 RAR actually feels like, so you don't have to fail regularly. Next question from Telvani Wizard Money Gang. Long name there. How do you feel about taking advice from gear-using influencers? I feel there's a lot of good advice being discarded by natty lifters because they hear it from someone on steroids, but I myself sometimes question the validity of some of the advice. So here's the thing about steroids is it is so much harder to experiment with your training and get an honest assessment when you're on gear versus when you're natural. Because when you're natural, your body doesn't just grow because, oh, you went to the gym and you moved around a bit. You have to force growth to happen. You have to train harder than people that are on gear. That's a fact, obviously. And just lifting in general is harder when you're natural, 100%. That's not to take away anything from people on gear and accomplishments they've made, but when you're natural, you get to see what your body actually responds to from a pure training stimulus without anything overriding that. We've all seen the studies of people taking gear growing more just sitting on the couch taking gear than people that are actually lifting naturally. So if you take someone that gains more muscle than someone like me would when I'm training my butt off, and they're just taking steroids and not even training, what do you think curling the pink dumbbells will do? That will probably give them even more growth than they're getting just sitting on the couch. So their baseline is building muscle at a faster rate than someone like us would build even with training. When they do anything, they can even power build. They'll build a significant amount of muscle. So this is a major red flag in my opinion. With that said, if someone is on gear and maybe they're a coach that has success training natural lifters, or if they've found ways to get people exponentially more growth that are already on gear and haven't seen much growth even with decent training methods, this could be someone that gives out good advice. So I steer clear of it personally. There's a handful of people that I'll listen to that are actually on gear, but generally I do try and steer clear of it just because you never know. It's just not worth it. I mean, when you think about it, like the only reason why Mr. Olympia and the best enhanced bodybuilders are Mr. Olympia and the best bodybuilders is because of the gear. So when you take these people that are the best enhanced bodybuilders, the reason they're the best enhanced bodybuilders is because of the gear itself. We know what the general quote unquote natural limit is. So when you take away the gear from these people, they look at best like a peak natural lifter, at best. So it's tough to say. I mean, we already know what peak natural lifters look like, so why not just take advice from them? We have good resources out here. Look at someone like Alex Leonidas, for example. He's, I'd say, pretty close to being a peak natural lifter. And who knows, guys, like the best bodybuilders, genetics aside, those guys would look no better than somebody like him. They wouldn't look that much bigger than someone like myself, which is kind of crazy to say, but there's a reason why those guys gain dozens of pounds of more muscle than the top natties, and it's not because their training systems are better. Next question from Joel Krizky 778. What was your biggest plateau and how did you surpass it? So for me, it was being a hair under 16-inch arms. That was a pretty brutal plateau, and obviously the cause of that was just through false hope of like the mainstream definition of power building, where I thought, oh, well, deadlifts will grow my biceps and forearms and bench will grow my triceps, so I'll max out my natty limit like this. The way I got through this was taking lifts like the preacher curl, the Smith JM press, push downs, other curl variations, just as seriously as I used to take the big three. And by doing this and emphasizing my range of motion, technique, proximity to failure, I now have, I'm closing in on 17.25-inch arms. That's over 1.25 inches bigger than when I was at my peak strength in the power lifts, at least. So just training for hypertrophy is what got me to it. So I mean, I've seen some people commenting on this whole power building thing, like, oh, what's the point? You have all these people arguing about power building and you're already an advanced lifter. And technically, by my numbers, I was an advanced lifter, but if I hadn't experimented with bodybuilding and changed my mindset to say, well, I'm done power building, I never would have known that I had well over 1 inch left in arm growth. And I probably still have 1 inch left of arm growth. So I would have just accepted the fate of me maxing out my arms over 2 inches smaller than what their actual capacity is. So that was my biggest plateau, and I broke it just by changing my training method and actually understanding biomechanics, resistance profiles, stuff like this, and of course just psychologically prioritizing them again. Next question from Jordan Jacobs 157. You spoke about doing 1 to 3 sets per given exercise. Do you feel like doing 4 sets on a certain exercise is superfluous work in most cases? If you're trying to be efficient time-wise, no. If you need to go up to 4 sets on a lift to progress and to grow, that's totally fine. If you aren't very time restricted, I would simply just cap a lift at 3 sets and add in another variation. 4 sets can have its time and place for sure, so it's not just as soon as you get to 4 sets, ditch that lift entirely. But in most cases, I would probably opt to say, all right, if 3 sets isn't quite enough on this lift, I'd either consider rotating the lift or just sticking at 3 and adding 1 set of a new variation, since if you're not growing at all from that, you probably do just need to hit the muscle in a different angle with a different resistance profile to get it growing and potentially fix up little hidden weak spots in little areas of the muscle that you don't know are being ignored through your current lift. There's no one lift that can maximize every range of motion, every muscle fiber from every angle. So having variety is definitely going to be key here. Next question from JackU8513. How much size should you be putting on your measurements each month to know you're making progress? Obviously, how much you grow each month is entirely personal, but I'm curious if there's a percent of your measurement that you should be adding onto your arms each month. How much do your measurements go up each month? So for me personally, a lot of my measurements don't necessarily see growth month over month because I'm getting to the point where sometimes the actual growth is smaller than what the usual room for error is, and it can be a little bit tough for me to detect growth month over month, so I do have to look at things a little bit longer term. With that said, if we're a little over 10 months into the year and my arms are up about 5/8 of an inch, that means I'm gaining about 1/14 to 1/16 of an inch per month. Of course, on an actual tape measure, this is somewhat undetectable, But my counter to this is, of course, one, there is a cut involved. So I lost size and then gained it at a slightly faster rate. And obviously, I didn't truly lose muscle. I just lost a little bit of fat. Maybe I lost a little muscle. That's a debate for another time. But with this, even if the room for error is going to be larger than the actual increments in growth that I do see, with this, let's say my room for error is 1/8 of an inch up or 1/8 of an inch down on my true size. Even if I am, say, down 1/8 of an inch just from room for error on month 1, then up 1/8 and down 1/8 month over month, the trend line will still be trending up in the right direction. And if I've added a true 3/4 of an inch to my arm, you can still see, even if there is room for error, and that does end up happening with 1/8 of an inch in either direction on any measurement, that's still not even close to 3/4 of an inch. So the actual growth will override that in the trend line that you have. So I would say when it comes to arm growth, I can't give you any specific numbers because it's incredibly individual. But the one thing I would look out for is your arm to waist ratio. These are the two most reliable measurements in my opinion, because your arms have a defined peak and your waist has a defined smallest point that you can measure. When it comes to measurements like, say, your quads, those are a little bit tougher because they're cone shaped. When you take like a shoulder or chest measurement, of course your lungs are a variable, and then your lats and other muscles also play into that too. So it's a little bit tougher to see what's actually growing and what's not. So arm to waist ratio, two most reliable measurements. Try and see how those are growing over the course of your bulk, and try and make your arms grow at a fast rate and try and get them to keep up with your waist. I'm not going to give you any growth specific ratios, like they should be adding an inch at the same time, because that is incredibly individual. Just something to keep an eye on to see how your growth is relative to your fat gain during your bulk, and try and optimize that. Of course, experiment with your training, try and make sure that ratio is the best that you can do, but don't stress too much about it. Next question from Sword of Honor 2. As a bodybuilder, I've realized that we should not listen to powerlifters, just as you've been saying for ages now. Have you changed your mind in this at all since the start of the channel? No. If anything, I'm just even more solidified in my views because of how much growth that I've gotten in the past year and a half, 2 years. Like, I'm now proving to myself that bodybuilding ultimately is the way to go. I don't think I ever would have gotten to 17-inch arms from just powerlifting. Like, I know Alex Leonidas talks about this too, where he got to a 4-plate chin-up and like, I think a 405 bench, and his arms were still either 16 or 16 and a half inches in either scenario. That's not what they should be for somebody that's that strong. So seeing that in other people, and then specifically seeing that in myself a little bit, and now seeing it to borderline and extreme, it's solidified my views quite a bit because I've experimented so heavily in each side of training. And now that I keep growing and my arms are almost 17.25 inches, like, I never even thought that was possible. And now that my belief and my trends that kind of showed me this thing are continuing to be proven true, and even to a stronger degree, I believe in bodybuilding much more than I ever have, and I always will. Of course, I'm going to learn more, and I might change my mind on some things. But as far as powerlifting goes, I mean, it's revived my entire lifting career. I thought I was at my peak when I wasn't. I was far away from it, and I'm still not close to it. Next question from the Toilet Man. Do you have any tips or sources to learn about biomechanics and or other relevant stuff that might be of interest? Of course, training related stuff. I would say look at Kasim Hansen for biomechanics. He's probably the best it gets. He has quite a few demos. Brian Borstein is another person that kind of works with / under him on certain projects. He's someone that has a pretty cool podcast. Eat, Train, Prosper, I think, is the name of their podcast. He's got a good channel where he demonstrates, he just does shorts. They're usually like a minute long, but he'll do like a working set with specific biomechanic biases in each lift, and he understands it pretty well and has a great physique too. So I would say those two guys are definitely trusted sources that you can learn from and kind of see firsthand in an advanced natural lifter in Brian Borstein. So that's what I would check out for sure. Next question from Call Me Stinks. Describe the lowest point mentally of your lifting career. That's a good question, but I would say when I lost my love for bodybuilding and kind of fell for the addiction of the ego boost of powerlifting. And for me, that's all it was. I respect powerlifters and people that truly love it, but for me, it was something that I found out I could be good at, and I was just addicted to boosting my ego and getting that egotistical satisfaction of adding weight to the bar, which wasn't truly satisfying and fulfilling. It was just kind of like addicting, and it stole my love for bodybuilding, I think. So that was probably my lowest point. I had a very hard time doing any lifts that weren't the big three because that's all I was hooked on them, and anything else was just boring to me. It was just fluff and pump. I got into a mindset where I would say, I'm like, all right, I'm going to do 3 sets of push downs, then I do 2, and I'm like, is there even a point in doing a third set? Like this lift is boring, it doesn't work. And then I would just leave the gym, and I would just start cutting corners in any way possible, and that just crept into my training and turned me into a minimalist and somebody that I really wasn't. And that was probably the lowest point, where I was just putting so much time and energy into stuff that I truly didn't actually care about. Next question from Tommy Meyer 2628. How did basement bodybuilding meet Miss Basement? You will be shocked that I actually met her at the gym. And final question from Eric for the Q&A. How does your progression look like in the long run? Maybe you can give some insight into your logbook, maybe showing your squat progression or other movements over the last year. Thanks and greetings from Germany. So the way my spreadsheet is set up is going to be a pain to post every little thing on the screen, but what I can tell you is, say hack squats, for example, I basically add 1 rep to any of my sets every single time. And the way I do this is, 1, training super hard and training in a way that is stimulative and builds me muscle. That's by far the most important thing. 2, have good exercise selection that actually grows the muscles that you're trying to target. Obviously, technique and range of motion come into a huge play here, and of course, most importantly, your effort levels. Basically, when a rep is there, you have to take it. So this is where being too passive in your progression, not the actual progressive overload aspect, but training to 0 RIR and being honest with yourself about it. This is where, if you're very passive and you're a little bit hesitant, this can hold you back. Because for myself, I don't implement a specific form of progressive overload. I take an ironically passive approach to my progression. But when you take a passive approach, you have to be aggressive in your lifting. So if you are going to take a passive progression approach like I do, where I don't have set progressions, like week 1 I do 1 set of 10 at 100 pounds. Week 2 is 2 sets of 10 at 100 pounds. Then week 3 is a set of 10 and a set of 12 at 100 pounds or whatever. My progression is very passive, but you have to be assertive and you have to be aggressive for that to work. So that doesn't just mean, oh, I'll add reps and they'll come naturally and I don't have to work that hard to make it happen. You have to be extra aggressive because you don't have to force them to happen, but you have to have the awareness of when progressions are there and you have to take them. So what I do is I train at 0 RIR, and it's an honest 0 RIR. So if I hit 8 reps on hack squats at 4.5 plates, and then next week I do 4.5 plates again for 8 reps, if the 9th rep is there, I have to take it no matter how hard it is. And that's where being aggressive in seeing if it happens actually helps you out. It's better to fail and realize that what you're doing isn't working than try and shy away from your progression. Because if I'm stuck at a certain weight, then I need to know that so I can adjust my program, whether it's changing my stance, changing my technique, changing my tempo, adding in another set, rotating my lifts, adding in a secondary lift, things like this. You want to know if you're plateaued. So generally, I'd say for most lifts, I'm adding about 1 rep across any of my 1, 2, or 3 sets each session. This isn't always the case, though, especially for lifts that are a little bit lighter. There are times where I'm like plateaued for even up to a full month, but I'm still growing because progression just slows down and it doesn't happen every single session. One mistake a lot of people make is they try and gamify bodybuilding too much, where it's, oh, I did one session, so this equals one extra rep of output in my next session. And it's a gamified mindset. It doesn't work like that. So one, there's always going to be room for error, whether it's you accidentally or purposefully made your technique harder. Maybe you got less sleep. Maybe you have lower energy for whatever reason. Maybe you're less recovered this time and you took one less extra rest day. Maybe you took an extra rest day and ate more the day before, so you have better performance. There are these little errors, this room for error that will fluctuate you a little bit up and down. So similar to the measurements that I talked about, your training performance can be the same way. And the thing is, adding reps and progressing in your training doesn't have to be so black and white. Like, oh, I did a good session on quads, that equals 1 rep per set on my next session. Sometimes you need 3 sessions at the same weight, same rep, same tempo, and same technique to get muscle growth. Why does it have to be from 1 session? Why does it have to be from 1 week? Why can't it be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 8 sessions, 4 sessions? So I think you need to look at it a little bit in a broader scope and zoom out a little bit. And this is obviously a tangent from the initial question, but that's my advice for people that are super worried about progressions and looking at it in a very black and white way. And I find this helps a lot, especially for people that are prone to progressive overload anxiety. So with that said, this has been a super long video. If you have any questions for the next one, let me know, and I will see you guys in the next one.